Hi everyone, Mrs. Ortega here. We're going to pick up right where we left off in second half of chapter 42. So we're going to look here at blood components and how they function in exchange, transport, and defense. Then we'll take a look at the gas exchange system, the respiratory system, and the lungs. So looking at the closed circulatory systems of vertebrates, they have a highly specialized fluid called blood. Blood in vertebrates is a connective tissue. It consists of several kinds of cells. These cells are suspended in a liquid matrix called plasma. Plasma has inorganic salts like ions. They're also called electrolytes. Plasma proteins will influence the blood pH, help maintain osmotic balance between blood and interstitial fluid. There are certain plasma proteins that function in lipid transport, immunity, and blood clotting. So here's a diagram of the plasma and the cellular elements that make up blood. And so for us, we want to understand what plasma consists of. It consists of water, ions, proteins, and other substances, other nutrients, waste products, gases, hormones. The individual examples you see in this chart, you do not have to memorize. You can also see cellular elements. The cellular elements are divided based on cell type. The white blood cells are leukocytes, and the red blood cells, erythrocytes, are shown, along with parts of cells called platelets. And so inside the blood plasma, the two types of cells we just looked at, red blood cells transport oxygen, white blood cells function in defense and immunity, and platelets are responsible or involved in blood clotting, so forming blood clots. And here, looking at the red blood cells, or erythrocytes, are the most numerous. They contain hemoglobin, which is a protein that transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so in each molecule of hemoglobin, it can bind up to 4 molecules of oxygen, as they have 4 subunits, each with an iron molecule that binds oxygen. And so for mammals, mature red blood cells will lack nuclei and mitochondria. And so during development, the red blood cell will start out with those things, and they will undergo a loss of the nuclei and mitochondria in order to make more room for hemoglobin. The leukocytes, there are 5 major types that are shown here. You do not have to memorize these 5 types. You want to focus on what their function is, and that's defense and immunity. So they're going to ingest or take in bacteria, debris, and mount immune responses against foreign substances. And so looking at these cells, the erythrocytes, eukaryocytes, they all develop from a common source of stem cells that are found in the red marrow of bones. While this is very, very important and has many different aspects, we will not focus on this, but there are many aspects of stem cells and the hormone erythropoietin, EPO for short, that will stimulate production of red blood cells. That is very, very valuable in terms of scientific research, understanding treatments for patients. So here you can see how that process comes about in terms of cell development. Stem cells in the bone marrow will lead to the lymphoid and myeloid stem cells, and these will produce other cell types that you see below. But again, this is not something I ask you to memorize. Blood clotting. So blood clotting is done, we saw, with the help of platelets. But there is a process that occurs called coagulation. It's the formation of a solid clot. And so this happens through a positive feedback mechanism where a cascade of reactions converts inactive fibrogen to fibrin, and that will, along with platelets, forms a clot. And so this can form within a blood vessel, and that would be called a thrombus, and that can block blood flow, which is detrimental to the person, to the animal. So here you can see the collagen fibers and the platelet coming to the rescue of that damaged blood vessel wall. And so it plugs it up and forms a fibrin clot. And so you can see the cascade of enzymes through positive feedback of how that happens. And so in terms of disease, there are lots of diseases and lots of aspects of the cardiovascular disease that are disorders of the heart and blood vessels. It can range in seriousness from minor disturbances to life-threatening disruptions. One here, they mentioned atherosclerosis, that's a buildup of fatty deposits within arteries. You can see there. But we will focus on cholesterol and how it travels through the blood in large particles of thousands of cholesterol molecules that are bound to a protein. And so they're divided based on their density. Low density lipoprotein cholesterol is delivered to cells for membrane production. And a high-density lipoprotein is going to scavenge excess cholesterol for return to the liver. And so in terms of cholesterol, patients want a high LDL and a low LDL. The low LDL can contribute to a risk for heart disease and other factors. In terms of heart malfunction, a heart attack or myocardial infarction is the damage or death of cardiac muscle tissue resulting from blockage of one or more coronary arteries. So coronary arteries will go to the heart. So this provides the heart with the oxygen that it needs for its muscle cells and its other tissues to pump blood continuously. And so when there's a blockage in one of those arteries, that can result in a heart attack. A stroke is defined as the death of nervous tissue in the brain. This usually results from a rupture or blockage of the arteries in the head, and so is also part of cardiovascular disease, and that is a result, can be a result of blockage of the arteries that go to the head. And so that, again, can be minor, could be a very, very serious, if not fatal, event. Partial blockage of coronary arteries is called angina. For this slide, you'll want to focus on heart attack and stroke. And so what do you do with arteries that are partially blocked or have plaques? If very serious in nature, a stent can be used. Nowadays, there are other methods such as different molecules or solutions that can be injected to try to dissolve these things and dissolve blood clots. But sometimes, in some cases, stents are used. So a stent is going to be placed into the vessel and it's going to keep it open. And so that by putting the stent in when it's closed, that's around the balloon, inflating the balloon, opening up the stent, that will then stay open when it's opened, and so it's not going to fall back or fold back into place. It's going to stay in that area, and so now leaving that stent in place, it will keep blood flow going through that blood vessel. And so here we can see risk factors in treatment of cardiovascular disease. in terms of LDL, HDL ratio, exercise, diet, avoiding smoking. Those things can help with controlling the proportions. When necessary, drugs, a whole class of drugs that end in statin, like atorvastatin, rosuvastatin, can reduce LDL and risk of heart attacks. There are other medications for cholesterol as well that work in slightly different ways. But the statin class has been around for a very long time and is efficient at reducing LDL levels. Other aspects are shown here of hypertension, that the use of aspirin is also shown here, but again, nothing that you need to try to memorize there. And so that wraps up our circulatory system, and now it's going to bring us to our gas exchange or respiratory system. And so now that we've understand how the circulatory system works, we'll focus on how the respiratory system exchanges gas. And so gas exchange supplies oxygen for cellular respiration. It disposes of carbon dioxide waste. And so animals can use air or water as the oxygen source or the respiratory medium. But for any given volume, there's going to be less oxygen available in water than there is in air. So it's much easier to get the oxygen needed from air than water. And so evolutionary speaking, air is much more efficient for animals, and thereby would be the adaptation that animals have made from moving from water to air. And so animals require large surfaces for gas exchange. These must maintain a moisture content or moisture level to allow for efficient transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide freely from cell to cell through diffusion. And so there are different respiratory surfaces. We'll look at some of those. They are the skin, gills, tracheae, and lungs. So taking a look at gills, these are found in aquatic animals, and they're defined as outfoldings of the body. This creates a large surface area for exchange. Ventilation is defined as a flow or movement over the surface of the respiratory region. So in this case, it would be the flow of water over the gills is ventilation. But the flow of air through the lungs would be ventilation as well for humans and other mammals. Something important about gills in fish, they have something called a countercurrent exchange system, in which the blood flow is opposite than the water flow. And so by having this opposite direction of blood flow, it allows for better exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide with water. As we've seen already, water has much less oxygen content per volume, and so maximizing the amount of oxygen that is in the water is what the fish want to do. And so in fish gills, more than 80% of the oxygen dissolved in the water is removed, and so that is a very efficient number. And so in the gill, you can see they have several gill arches. These gill arches branch out to gill filaments. On each filament are rings called lamella or lamellae for plural. And as you can see, they have capillaries that go from the filaments to the blood vessels that are in the gill arch. And so looking at an individual filament, you can see they have rings called lamella for singular, lamellae for plural. And so these areas are the sites of gas exchange. And so as you can see, the water flow is in one direction. This way, in this example, the blood flow will be the opposite direction. And so that allows for exchange of the oxygen more efficiently. as if you look in the net diffusion of O2 down here, you can see the partial pressure of oxygen in millimeters of mercury of water compared to the partial pressure of oxygen millimeters of mercury in the blood. Starting out at the red end here, the partial pressure of mercury in the blood is very high, which is good. So it's 140. That's where where the fish will want to be. And as you move in the water direction, is still very high starting out. So 150 is still going to allow oxygen to move from the water to the blood, as the oxygen will move from where it's more concentration, where there's a higher pressure, to where there's a lower pressure. And so as you move across in terms of water flow direction, the oxygen percentage goes down as it's continually moving into the blood vessel here. And so looking at the end there, it's getting the maximum amount of oxygen that it can. If it were the other direction, if the water flow were to be that way and the blood flow to be this way, it would stop at when both of them equal 50. And so then you only use half of the water that's, half of the oxygen that's being flowed over those gills. So it's not efficient that way. That's counter-current exchange. You want to understand what that means. Blood flow is opposite than water flow. Looking at tracheal system in insects, the tracheal system is perhaps one of the most unusual systems that you'll see in this chapter, in that they have a network of tubes that extend throughout their body. These tubes are not connected to the circulatory system. They're completely separate, and they're responsible for exchanging gas. As we'll see in this next picture, these insects have these network of tubes. They have to be ventilated and through different methods, through body movement, through other movement. They have to be ventilated to meet the demands of the oxygen the man needs. Okay, so the tracheal system of insects, so they have, to meet the large demands of oxygen, they have to use their body movement to help propel that through. So let's take a look at that image here. And so on this grasshopper, you can see they have external openings along the side, the lateral side of their body, the left and right sides, and ranging from about midsection of their body to the posterior end. You can see these external openings have valves that will open and close to trachea. Then these large tubule branches will then go to tracheals, and then to go to body cells, or to an air sac that's usually around large organs that will help with exchanging gas quickly and efficiently. And so the air movements moving throughout these tubes will be done through body movement and through cycling of that air through those tubes. And so it is much, much different. It's not connected to the circulatory system, which is perhaps one of the most unifying unique traits about this system. But moving on to the lungs. Lungs are infolding of the body surface. So this is going to be interior versus versus exterior of the gills. And so the lungs will have the circulatory system to transport the gas between the lungs and the rest of the body. And the size and complexity correlate with the animal's metabolic rate. If you remember from BIOL 1, I believe in chapter 9 or unit 9, you did cellular respiration with metabolic rate of animals with the rat experiment. You can tie that in with this section here, that metabolic rate is going to vary from animal to animal. Usually the larger the animal, the lower the rate. The smaller the animal, the bigger the rate. And so we're going to take a look at the respiratory system for humans. So looking at how air is inhaled through the nostrils. This will be filtered, warmed, humidified, and sampled for odors before it goes to the pharynx, which will direct the air to the lungs through the larynx region. So larynx region will be the region that has the epiglottis. So the epiglottis will be up for the trachea to lead air to the trachea, whereas it'll be down, the epiglottis will be down to swallow food to the esophagus. And so as air passes through the larynx, the pharynx, the larynx, trachea, then it's going to go to tubes called bronchi and then bronchioles. From bronchioles, it'll go to the alveoli, the sacs where gas exchange occurs. And so as air is exhaled, it will pass over the larynx region, which contains the vocal cords to create sounds. And so a high-pitched sound is going to be created by fast vibrations, whereas a low-pitched sound is going to be created with low vibrations. And so in this area, the cilia and mucus are going to line the epithelium of air ducts and move particles up to the pharynx. And so any pollutants that are inhaled by the lungs, if they stick around in the lungs onto that sticky, moist surface area, it's going to be moved by cilia and by mucus up and out of hopefully up and out of the whole system and back into the pharynx, where it can then be swallowed through the esophagus, where most likely if a bacteria or something foreign can be killed by that stomach acid. And so that's dubbed or called the mucus escalator. It cleans the respiratory system and allows particles to be swallowed into the esophagus. And so the alveoli are the air sacs that are on the tips of bronchioles that allow for gas exchange to occur. And so you can see that here, inhaling through the nasal cavity or through the mouth will lead the air to the pharynx, then to the larynx region, then to the trachea, and then trachea parts to two bronchi or bronchus. Those then go to bronchioles and then to alveoli. Other factors of the lungs are shown here. The surfactants are secretions that coat the surface of the alveoli that prevent collapsing. They're so thin, so subject to damage or destruction, as they could easily be collapsible without surfactants. Along with other factors of measurement like tidal volume, vital capacity, residual volume. All these, while very important, are not things I will test you on. One thing that is good to understand, though, is how the breathing is done. And in terms of ventilation, it's in two stages. Inhalation, which is breathing air in, and exhalation, which is releasing air out. And so those are two stages of ventilation, and this is called also called negative pressure breathing. As when you inhale, the diaphragm muscle that moves down, as that you see there, and the rib muscles bring the ribs up. And I like to correlate that with like the pulling up of blinds from the bottom. These ribs will move upwards and also move outwards, and so that creates a larger area, larger surface area, not surface area, larger volume capacity that will reduce the pressure. And so that by proxy will move air from the higher pressure in the atmosphere to the lower pressure in your lungs. So it moves air in. And then as you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and moves, restores its original position upwards. The ribs move back down and move back in, and that reduces the volume there in the lungs, and so that pushes the air out. So breathing is controlled and regulated by involuntary mechanisms that are found in the medulla oblongata of the brain. That is a region we'll see in chapter 49, so keep that in mind. And so it recognizes the rate and the depth of breathing in response to pH changes in the cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF for short. And so you can see that in diagram image here. Our normal blood pH is about 7.4. This pH will fall lower when carbon dioxide is increased in the tissues. And so when carbon dioxide gets added to the blood, it forms bicarbonate or carbonic acid, which lowers the pH. And so when carbon dioxide's added to the blood, it lowers pH. And so that falling level is detected through the cerebral spinal fluid because that carbon dioxide can also travel to the CSF from the circulatory system. And so that's detected by the medulla oblongata. It can also be registered through sensors in major blood vessels that detect the decrease in blood pH. And so then the medulla receives these signals and then sends out signals to increase rate and depth of ventilation of breathing. And so then that restores the amount of oxygen, lowers the amount of carbon dioxide, and restores the pH value. And so here I have a video on gas exchange I'll play that will summarize this chapter.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy, and breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract, increasing the volume of your lungs. When you exhale, these muscles relax, decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs. When lung volume decreases, air pressure increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs. Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the two bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. One oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells, into the plasma, and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs. And that's how you release carbon dioxide, get oxygen, and keep on running.
Okay, well that summarizes this chapter, and so if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, next videos will be Chapter 44, Osmoregulation, and Chapter 49, the nervous system, which the last one, Chapter 49, is very short, so we're almost there. Bye-bye for now.